Welcome back to Beyond the Veil, where we talk about that division between this world and the spiritual world that is separated by a veil, but in Jesus Christ that veil has been rent, and that's what we're trying to understand in Beyond the Veil. Now, if you've watched any of these recent podcasts, you know we're doing two series, and they're running concurrent with each other. The first series is the love of money, and we're going to continue that series in this broadcast. The other one, which I highly recommend because they're parallel and we discuss similar themes in both, is the idea of forms, categories, which is how we understand and perceive things that in many ways are unknowable because they're beyond us. For example, God is infinite. To think that we can understand God in his totality is just ridiculous. We're finite. We're categorical, and categories are limited. And that's what the enemy in Babylon, which is these demons, trade upon, is our ignorance and our limitations. We talked a little bit about that last time. Well, we're going to continue to talk today about the root of evil, which is the love of money. As the scripture says that the love of money is the root of all sources and kinds of evil. So there's kinds of evil that we might get into in this broadcast. And really to understand the kinds of evil, we need to kind of talk a little bit about sin. And from an economics point of view, we're going to talk about self-interest or self-focus. Okay. As we've talked about it before, God is very different from us in the sense that God, as we know him in the Godhead, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we know that God is it's more than selfless. It's that his awareness of self is tied to his concern for others. Okay, and we've talked about this. So when Jesus comes to the earth, what does he do? Does he come to do his own will? No. He comes to do the will of the Father. When the Holy Spirit comes, does he talk about himself and explain who he is? No. He's there to point us to Jesus, to bring us into, as the Spirit of life, to bring us into a relational understanding of Jesus, more in addition to any categorical or categorical understandings, or what we might call propositions. And last time we talked a little bit about propositional versus relational theology. Well, that's going to be a continuing theme. So again, and I used this example in one of the broadcasts, or I didn't, and I'll use it again. If when I was a young man and I was interested in my wife, Pam, I was seeing a mentor of mine, and he said, what if there was a book of Pam, that had every fact known about Pam was in that book. And I read that book and I memorized that book, but I never met Pam. I would have a propositional understanding of Pam, and like a theologian or a doctorate in theology, I could possibly outwit everybody and outtalk everybody about propositions about God. But do I have a relational understanding of God? Do I feel him in me? Do I have a peace that passes all understanding? That's a different question, as we talked a little bit. So this understanding of propositional versus relational is going to be a continuing theme, and we start with the idea that God is focused on us. And we talked about the ontological, about how God created the world for a reason, a purpose, and his purpose in creating us is to love us, to be in relationship with us. That's a completely different purpose than Lucifer or Satan operates upon, and how he sees creation is completely different. And part of his way of maintaining control is through the categories and forms, one of which is the Babylonian money system. So that's where we start. When I was a young man, and I probably mentioned this in a broadcast, there were two classes I took that changed how I looked at things. One was epistemology, and we're not going to go in that. But the other was an economics class, and it was micro, not macro, microeconomics that sought to explain how people make decisions, what goes into the decisions. And, in an economic system, which we talked about last time, there's a barter system versus that's relational versus the monetary systems that are based upon some currency. Okay, we talked about that. Well, let's explore that a little bit more as we go on. So in microeconomics, you start out with the presumption that undergirds all of microeconomics, and that is that human beings individually are self-interested. We talked a little bit about this last time. That means they're more concerned, or their first interest is themselves. So they wake up in the morning and they're hungry. And they may be aware that someplace in a world far away from them, people are starving. And they're not starving, but they're hungry. They become aware of that. They're self-interested, not so much in feeding the starving, at that point, feeding the starving people elsewhere, but in meeting their own hunger. So they're self-driven, they're self-motivated. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the good of others might not enter into their calculations. But at the heart of things, they're self-centered, self-focused. So that becomes the driving force behind any system of exchange. Remember, we talked about economics, which is that the word literally means the household management. Well, what does that mean? That means if you're managing your household, are you going to be more concerned in making the decisions based upon what your family needs versus what the family down the street needs, or the family across town, or the family in a different nation even? Yes, because again, what has happened to human beings since the fall is what we call the fall. When their eyes were open and they saw there were consequences to their actions, their focus has been on, I better make the right decision, and that translates into making the best deal, as we're going to say. Now, I could put up on the board graphs, and maybe I'll do that at a certain point in time. But the heart of this, as I've been saying, is that when I can't meet all my needs, as we talked about earlier. So when I need something because I'm hungry, I need housing, whatever, I cannot live in this world without making connections or agreements with other people. So I go out into the world and I get, let's say I need transportation. I need a car. So I go out and I'm going to look for a car. Okay. What I need is transportation. Get me from one point to another point. But there's a lot that's going to factor into that decision. Okay. Now I go out and I find a car, and it will do the job. I mean, it will take me from point A to point B and back again. It meets that transportation need. Okay, and it's got a price on the window, and it tells me what it is. Now, let's just say that I'm rational and I look at this, okay, and I say, okay, I look at the price and I do a calculation of how many hours I would have to work for that car, okay. Because all I want is transportation from point A to point B. Well, I come up with the number and I step back and I say, well, the car's nice, but the price is more hours than I'm willing to spend for that car, because I can go out and buy another car that gets me from point A to point B that I don't have to work as long for. So to me, the price is too high for the need I have. Okay, the need is, in fact, I may even start to think, well, I could take a bus, and I may calculate, that means waiting in line and all of that. And so I calculate all of that into the decision. I say, no, I really need a car because I don't have time to wait on buses or whatever, or that's not having to wait on bus is worth more than more to me. I'll work more hours for that privilege of not waiting on the buses. Now, some people don't have that luxury of making those things, and they just wait in line for the buses because they have to get from point A to point B. But I'm looking at this car, and I say, okay, this car, better look for another one. And the salesman comes up and he looks at me and he says, you like the car? And I said, yeah, it's a little bit too much. Now, maybe there's negotiation room in that price. He may take less for the car than it's listed for. But if he does, you can bet it's going to affect him. He's going to bear that cost. Because, see, he's looking at it in a self-interested way. If I could sell the car for this price, this big price over here, I'll make X amount of dollars. And those dollars, he's going to, whether he does it on paper or that, but he's thinking, man, that's all these other things I could buy and how much time I would have to work and sweat, blood, tears, all of that to get these things. If I can sell this car to this guy for that price, I don't have to work as much. I get more for less. More for less. So everybody's looking to maximize their self-interest and get more for less. Now, at first blush, we might say, well, that's bad. No, it's not bad. It's just the reality of living in a world. Why would you work 10 hours when you could get something you want or need for working 6 hours? You would be foolish to spend the extra money or work the 10 hours when you can meet that need for yourself, for your family. See, now you're starting to look at other people than you in this calculation. So you can say, I'm going to maximize my return by paying less and getting more. Okay, so that's a rational thing to do. Why would you would actually be harming your family if you spent more for the car or whatever than you had to meet the need. Okay, because let's say the car I'm looking at is a sports car. Okay, well, do I need a sports car? No, a regular car would do. Okay, a lot less. Would I maybe want a sports car or desire a sports car? Maybe. And now I need to calculate that in. Why do I want a sports car? What does it give me that a regular car doesn't give me? And so, because my wife might not look at the sports car with the same wide old eyes that I might look at. Okay, so the salesman comes up, and like I said, I tell him, no, it's too much money. You got something cheaper. Well, maybe everything that's cheaper on the lot, and he senses this guy's going to, he's going to try to bring the price down. So he's looking at the cars I might be describing or might want, might buy because they meet the basic need. He's looking at those cars and saying, well, their prices are lower, but so's my return. So if I sell him one of those cars, I'm going to make less. So maybe he starts to think like this. He starts to say, let's arouse that desire that might be hidden in him for a sports car. Okay, so he starts to say, well, yeah, I got other cars on the lot, but they're not as nice. Well, what does that mean? Well, maybe they're not as nice in the sense as, the upholstery's bad or whatever in them. But what is he actually saying? They're not as nice. What he's trying to do is get me to look at how others might perceive the car I'm driving. So other people might look at it and say, if I buy the sports car, gosh, that guy's really got it together. Maybe if I'm not married and I'm looking for to impress some girls or women, maybe that now is the motivation of why I picked out the sports car in the first place. I don't know. Okay, but there's all kinds of calculations in here. And so, but what the salesman's trying to do is instill in me some desires. And desires are a real funny thing, because when we desire something, we assume that something is going to satisfy a need. Okay. And that's why I've got here so what is evil? So what is evils? Okay, all sorts and kinds. Conflict between. Okay, there's a conflict between the desires. I want to pay the less price. I need to get from point A to point B, but at the same time, I have these other desires that this salesman, to maximize his return, is trying to awaken in me. This is how evil works. And I'm not saying the salesman is evil because he's out to maximize his return. But if he tries to get into my head and manipulate these desires in me, that's getting very close to evil, because that's what evil does. Evil gets us in this calculation of our self-interest to what we're going to call sin. Okay. But the word for sin in the Old Testament and the New Testament isn't like an affront against God. I sinned against the Lord. Now, you can sin against God, okay, sin against God, but not all sins are against God. And we even know that some sins are against ourselves, against others. What does that mean? So let's talk about sin. So sin is, in both the Greek and the Old Testament, means to make a mistake. That's all it means. It means to make a mistake. In fact, in the Hebrew, the mistake, the word for sin or mistake in the Hebrew, does not imply any moral judgment. It just means I got to the place in the road where I had to turn left or right, and I was headed to the grocery store, but I've been on that road before, and I normally, instead of turning right to go to the grocery store, I turn left to go to work, so I automatically turn left. I made a mistake. If I wanted to get to the grocery store, I turn right. If I wanted to get to the work, I turn left. I made a mistake. I'm heading in the wrong direction. This is why repent means to change your mind, to recognize you made a mistake and change your mind, change directions. That's all the word means, sin means, is to make a mistake. Okay, so how do I make mistakes? Well, mistakes are people make mistakes because they don't have all the information. Maybe they weren't watching where they were going. Maybe somebody told them, no, you go left at that light, not right, to go to the store. And they relied upon that. Maybe they were deceived. So let's bring it back to buying the car. If the salesman tells me something about the car that he knows is not true, but he knows I want to believe it's true. And I'll say this about myself, okay? Not to disparage myself, but I'm no Brad Pitt, okay? So it's a car is not going, if my goal is to get the hottest women in the world, okay, and I believe the salesman saying, boy, you get this car and you can have any woman you want, he knows that's a lie, or he should know that's a lie, because he's looking at me. He's like, okay, maybe a nice car will help him, but it's not going to get him the most beautiful woman in the world, okay? Because the most beautiful woman in the world can ride with anybody they want in all kinds of cars. So she's not necessarily going to be entering a relationship with me if I wasn't married because of the car, okay? That's just not going to happen. But if that salesman knows that's true and he pushes that, he keeps pushing that, because deep down I want to believe a lie is true, because I want what I can't have, then we've entered this place where we're entering the Babylon money system. Because the Babylonian money system, the transactional versus relational transactions, those money systems versus the relational systems like bartering, are fraught with allowing people, because you don't know the person, you don't know if they're telling you the truth, you don't know, you're actually making a decision based upon something that may not have any value. Like I talked about the fiat dollar, it doesn't really have any value. And as we talked briefly about last time, Azazel, who started the love or the value, the worship of gold, where we wanted gold because of the seduction that it gave women and all of this, which we talked about, then you can start to see how those systems will take advantage of the unwary, the people who don't know all the facts or things necessary not to make a mistake. And this is the Babylonian money system, or these kinds of money systems, is they're fraught with allowing evil. If you love it, if you trust it more than you do God relationally, then you open yourself to evil. That's why the love of money is the root of all sorts and kinds of evil. Because what it does, it trades upon our ignorance, and it makes us vulnerable to those who are smarter than we are, stronger than we are, have things on ball that appear to be on ball, things we might desire, better looks. We're a lot more likely to believe someone who's attractive than somebody who's not attractive. It's just scientists could tell you this. They study this kind of stuff. And even babies, little babies, showing that they're attracted to good-looking people versus not so good-looking people. The sound of some people's voices are irritating. Sometimes the sound of people's voices are soothing. So there's all of these things that are going in there that we're not necessarily aware of that affect our decisions. And when we meet the next time, we're going to get into this a little bit more. Why is that the case? I'm going to end with this. If you look at what got us into the place where we were aware that our decisions, like, do I get the car that's the sports car, or do I get the car that gets me at a cheaper price from A to B? Okay, those decisions. That decision's going to have real world consequences for me. If I buy one car believing it's going to do something for me, I make a mistake that it's not, and it's cost me more money, that's a real consequence. So when our eyes were opened by the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve eaten from the tree of knowledge, we became aware that we didn't have unlimited resources, that there was really things we had to negotiate in the world that had real consequences. Now, what I'm going to end with is this. What was the temptation to Eve? The temptation to Eve, we have to sort out a little bit. Okay, Eve was in the garden. She saw God in the garden. She also saw the serpent in the garden. And I'm going to submit to you, and we'll get into they were both translucent beings. That meant they reflected light. The light of God is himself. He's not really reflecting the light, but because he's translucent, we see the light in him. And the words, you'd have to go into the Hebrew in that, but he was translucent. So was the serpent. So in many ways, they appeared to Eve to be similar. The serpent in the Bible that tempts Eve is not this snake crawling around on his belly. Okay, that's what happens to Lucifer or Satan in the serpent. That's what happens. But he's not doing that. He's kind of walking around talking like God does, like Adam does. And they're in a translucent place where the glory of God is reflected in all of Eden and the trees, everything. So she's there, and and Lucifer asked her this question: did God say, don't touch, don't eat from that tree? And he said, don't touch. We talked about this the last time. But the temptation becomes this. And again, this is a being that appears to have knowledge she doesn't have, who tells her in her ignorance, tells her the reason why God doesn't want you to eat from that tree is, in the day you do, your eyes will be opened and you will know good and evil. Okay. She will know the consequences of good and evil, but she won't know good and evil in its totality the way God does. But yet the lie in the garden is your eyes will be opened and you will know good and evil and you will be like God. No, God is God. No one's is like him any more than anyone is exactly like me or you. And God is, the distinction's even more big. Okay, it's huge. So he lies to her. She takes the fruit and she says to herself, isn't it good to be like God? See, she made a mistake based upon deception that Lucifer told her, Satan told her. She made a mistake. And she says to herself, wouldn't it be good to be like God? Well, would it be good to be like God? We might think it would be. Wouldn't it be good to be rich like the guy down the street? Wouldn't it be good to be like the pretty girl in class? You don't know that, but because your desires are easily manipulated, you might say, well, it would be good to be rich. It would be good to be pretty like the girl down the street, or handsome like the guy down the street, or whatever other thing we come up with. Well, guess what? God created you the way he thought it was perfect for you. The fact that you don't see who you are, as we talked about, or see who God is, doesn't mean that you can figure it out through your intellect alone. You just can't. But a higher intellect, the doctorate in theology, the doctorate in economics, the people who have risen above us by their knowledge, which is what Babylon is about, they have knowledge we don't. Wouldn't it be good to know what they know? See the world like they are. That's the deception. Because if I did, I wouldn't make any mistakes. And that, only God never makes a mistake. Every other created thing is not God, and it will make mistakes. And God doesn't have a problem with mistakes. He only has a problem when our mistakes are exposed and we continue to make them over and over, and we tend to say, God, I'm going to be God. I'm not going to follow you. And we'll talk about that more later. But until then, shalom, have a great day, and I hope you continue to join us as we get more put more flesh on the bones of what we've been talking about in the Babylon money system.